and teacher David Berlinski's latest book, The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions, argues that science has not been able to prove God's inexistence nor explain the start of the universe. The program, hosted by the Discovery Institute in Washington, D.C., lasts about an hour.
Thank you all very much for coming here. I know that the greatest metaphysical division in all of our experience is the division between a writer who wishes his books to sell well and potential readers who are not all that interested in fulfilling a writer's wishes. Nonetheless, I'm grateful that you're all here today. I have to confess that I haven't read this either. This is the first time I've laid my eyes on it. But I have read the earlier versions, and I'm sure the book in my absence has only gotten better. Only gotten better. This is a book about, well, The Devil's Delusion is just the title, but it's really a book about atheism and its scientific pretensions, and I'd like all the stress to be on scientific and pretensions. Obviously, I wrote the book because sitting in my apartment in growing irritation at the success of Richard Dawkins' book, Christopher Hitchens' book, Sam Harris's book, Daniel Dennett's book, I said to myself, I need to cash in on this, that's one thing. And second of all, I need to present the other side. Perhaps I didn't present that in the most intellectually elegant way possible, but it corresponded to my thoughts. And the more I read of what Hitchens had to say and what Daniel Dennett had to say and what Sam Harris and what Richard Dawkins had to say, the more I thought that there really is another side to this question about atheism and its scientific pretensions. Of course, there's more than one side. There are a multitude of sides. What I thought 5 minutes before I started speaking tonight, I had a memory, kind of a flashback to the 1950s, which of course is a far better decade than anything that followed. And I remembered when the Soviets sent, what's-his-face, Yuri Gagarin, out into space. There was some pooch they sent first. I forgot the pooch's name. Does anybody remember it? You know, little dog, but the dog didn't have anything to say, didn't do anything up there in space. And when Gagarin came back, a story began to circulate. It was just a wonderful story. Evidently, senior members of the Politburo had told Gagarin before he blasted off, Yuri, have kind of a look around, would you? Yuri, you know, look around? Yeah, see if you see anything up there in the clouds. I mean, just take a look through the porthole. You know, Gagarin came back and he said, started speaking to all these bull-necked guys from the Politburo. You know, it's nice that you got into space, but did you see anything that might compromise our authority and power? You get the drift, right? And Gagarin said, no. Oh, the relief was just so considerable. All these guys saying, you know, nothing to worry about. There's no one up there sitting behind the clouds. Little did they know, little did they know. I thought of this story because it seems to me one of those odd stories that bounce around in history, full of strange reverberations. I thought of this story when I read Richard Dawkins' book, or when I read Sam Harris's book, or Daniel Dennett's book, or Christopher Hitchens' book, all these guys. They're all roughly in the same position of Yuri Gagarin. We had a look around, and just between us, we couldn't see anything. Therefore, there's nothing to be seen. This seems to be a leading theme of our experience in the 21st century. And it reflects all of the imposing authority, the monumental and richly deserved credibility of the scientific community, and the power and magnificence of the scientific tradition. We've all had a look around. The tradition seems to say, you know, we don't see anything. And it follows, anybody can follow this reasoning, even a child, that there's nothing to be seen. What also follows, and this is not evident to a child, is that because there's nothing to be seen, there's no reason to worry about any effort made to compromise the authority of the scientific institution itself. This last point seems to be particularly significant. It seems to me particularly significant because according to the scientific tradition's own principles, the one principle revered above all others is that the tradition be constantly under surveillance and constantly open to criticism. Now, we're all adults, we know that's just nonsense. The scientific tradition is not constantly under surveillance, and it's not constantly open to criticism. The fact of the matter is that unless you're an extremely great scientist, you react to criticism the way I do, and the way you do. It's just a loathsome kind of experience. Nobody wants to hear himself criticized, and scientists are just like anyone else. So I think the moment is interesting in that regard, in that the accessibility of criticism is always nearby. The willingness to hear it, to understand it, to meet it, to deal with it is where it always is, and that is in the remote and inaccessible distance. Well, why should this be a cause for concern? Why should we care? After all, in a really fundamental sense, we're all part of the scientific tradition, and we can't escape it. Sometimes Christopher Hitchens talks about the Enlightenment tradition. Noam Chomsky also uses the phrase. Somebody interviewed Noam Chomsky in between his usual posturing about world affairs and said, you know, Noam, what do you basically believe in? And he said, I'm a child of the Enlightenment. Child of the Enlightenment. Terrific, we all are. We're of the Enlightenment party for the very singular and important reason is that as far as we can tell, there's no other party we can join. None of us, I presume, are really tempted by the options that are now available. The Islamic world, although deeply minatory in many respects, is so remote from our experience and makes so many intellectual demands that we really cannot understand or fully accept that it's pointless to talk about an option other than the Enlightenment. We're all in the same boat. Me too. I did not write this book to question that. I cannot remove myself from the historical and emotional and intellectual juncture I find myself. I'm of the party of the Enlightenment too. I don't know another party to go to. Perhaps if I found one, I'd go there, but I can't find it. And I assume you're more or less in the same position. More or less in the same position. Therefore, we are all roughly adrift in a boat, and using a metaphor first made popular by the philosopher of science Neurath, we're trying to undertake repairs without sinking. It's not a very easy undertaking. We don't have an alternative position to which we can appeal. We have to do everything internally, including writing a book of this sort, questioning the premises of atheism and its scientific pretensions, because I think they badly need to be questioned. Not because I have a position of faith to advance, I don't. I write as a secular Jew. I remember perhaps 3 words of Hebrew, vaguely. I've forgotten everything I learned when I was 13, voluntarily. I cannot pray. I don't go to a temple. I don't go to a church. And I'm sure that my life, if judged soberly, would at once be dismissed by the hypothetical powers who make these moral judgments. Nonetheless, I've written this book. And I've written this book because it seems to me the access to atheism in the name of science, and after all, we don't have another name we can appeal to, has been premature. It's been extremely vulgar. It's been historically illiterate. And it's made some catastrophically mistaken judgments about what science can, cannot do, what it has, and what it has not done. In the book, I consider a number of representative topics. For example, there's an obvious question that all of us at one time or another ask. Traditionally, the time to ask the question is 3 a.m. in the morning. Oh, what am I doing here? Why am I here? For that matter, why is the universe there? What's it doing out there? There's this whole incredible panorama. And by 5 in the morning and breakfast, we generally forget the question. But the question is real. It's not an illusory question, no matter how many times philosophers say, well, the question is meaningless. Or to take a similar remark, Steven Weinberg, the great contemporary American physicist, one of the authors of the electroweak theory of unification, has a famous sentence. He said, you've got to imagine Steven Weinberg, rich with honor, a Nobel laureate, cashing in on this incredible salary at the University of Texas. There are flower petals scattered in front of him when he leaves the room to go to the men's room. You know what I think is the more the universe seems comprehensible, this is a quote, the more it also seems pointless. Here we have one of the great physicists of the late 20th century, rich with honor, prestige, dignity, all the usufructs a careless universe can confer, saying, you know, I may have understood it, but I can't see the point. And of course, everybody in the world jumped on him, poor guy, for that sentence. And a couple of years later, he said, you know, I thought it all over. The universe is really a fine place after all. I didn't mean to knock the universe. But the claim, let's forget about Steven Weinberg. The claim is very interesting. How easily we go to a claim about the pointlessness and meaninglessness and sterility of the physical universe, when at the same time we have fashioned our career and our existence by interpreting it. Surely there's some conflict between those two kinds of claims. If the universe is as pointless as Weinberg at one time believed it was, why is it so comprehensible? Why is electroweak unification even possible in a pointless universe? I think this is a second kind of question, in which the authority of science is aggressively pushed beyond what the authority of science can properly determine. And a third question, one that I think that you will agree is terribly difficult, terribly important, has to do with a completely different area of our experience, and that is the moral life. We all recognize that morality places certain demands on us. I mean, it's a trivial point. We are very different from the animals in the way we try, whether potently or impotently, to arrange our life not only for the moment, the satisfactions for the moment, but into a coherent narrative where we can at least make the claim, I've acted in this way because. And what follows the because is some appeal to a moral standard. We in the late 20th and early 21st century have just found it incredibly difficult to say to ourselves what that moral standard rests upon. I'm not saying I've got an answer. I'm saying we have found it very difficult. Attempts to interpret moral issues in terms of the consensus of a free society, as Richard Rorty, the philosopher, and my teacher, by the way, put it in discussing moral issues, seem to suffer a serious impediment when we consider that free agents in varying societies have come to radically different interpretations of what their moral obligations really are. And Rorty was an exceptionally intelligent guy. Of course, he knew that. And he asked himself, what can I say to Nazi Germany, which thinks it's just a great idea to exterminate 9 million European Jews, and after we finish with the Jews, we'll get rid of the gypsies, and when we finish up with the gypsies, the homosexuals, and then we have all of the Russians to exterminate. And to a certain extent, that was the free consensus of a society at a particular moment of time, because if it hadn't been the free consensus, there would have been no Holocaust. After all, it was not the free consensus in Denmark, it was not the free consensus in Italy, and it was not the free consensus in Bulgaria, strangely enough. In those societies, no Jews were killed. And Rorty, completely honest, said, well, I don't know. I got no objection. I have no objection to offer. For the rest of us, although we can admire Rorty's honesty, I think there's something recognizably malignant in his conclusions. Although for the life of us, we cannot say quite what it is. We cannot say quite what it is. I think this is an underlying threnody in our experience, an irritation that will not stop irritating us. And the moment we deny access to any form of divinity, clearly we deny ourselves access to any form of authority that could settle moral issues for us. The dilemma we find ourselves in, roughly as an intellectual society, the party of the Enlightenment, is that we cannot fully place our faith in any form of revelation, and at the same time we cannot place our doubt in everything. It's a very uncomfortable position, and to say that a token affirmation of atheism just settles it is not very acceptable at all. The fourth issue I would like to mention is I think that Darwin's theory of evolution plainly plays a very heavy, very suggestive role in all contemporary discussions. Richard Dawkins said that Darwinism has made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, and he wants others to be as full as he is. I think he's absolutely right. I think he's absolutely right. There is a correlation, a coordination, not a logical one. I'm not making a logical argument, but I think there is a connection between the extent to which an individual vests his belief in Darwin's theory of evolution and the extent to which he divests his belief in any form of revealed religion. This has made it exceptionally difficult to come to an honest assessment of our understanding in biology. Everyone has a certain amount of bad faith about this. Everyone has a certain amount. I don't exclude myself. I've made a tiny little reputation criticizing Darwin's theory of evolution. It's easy enough to do. Any scientific theory is easily criticized, including string theory, which I've also criticized. And every step of the way, I've scratched my head and said, I don't know. Maybe I'm all wrong about this. I still say that. Are these criticisms serious? Are they significant? Have we missed something, as I keep suggesting, of fundamental importance in the explanation we have of living system? Or are you simply behaving like a lamentable crank? And Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I think I'm behaving like a lamentable crank. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday, I think I'm behaving with rare perspicacity and intuition. But I think the truth of the matter is those who are professionally occupied in defending Darwin feel the same way deep down. They know there's something not quite right in demanding of a scientific theory that has this degree of reverence when it does not have a comparable degree of plausibility. And I think Dawkins, because he very often is good at framing these issues, put his finger exactly on what the issue is. Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. If you're not an intellectually fulfilled atheist, follows by contraposition that you're not a Darwinist either. If you're not a Darwinist either, why not? If you have something critical to say, the issue is not simply an issue of science. It's an issue of very general suggestiveness and importance. So I've given you 4 points where I think the contemporary avowal of atheism must be considered intellectually unacceptable and defective. That's not to say that it couldn't be improved. That's not to say that there might not be a richer, more suggestive body of doctrine and evidence to which we appeal. But at the point at which we find ourselves, that is more or less groping, confused, not sure of any answers, disappointed in the extent to which scientific theories have been successful, and at the same time utterly amazed at their success, I wrote the book because I wanted another point of view to be expressed. Whether that point of view will prevail, whether it will be considered incidental or trivial, I really don't know. But perhaps that's the only thing an author can ever say. I really don't know. And I hope for the best. And I think what would be appropriate now is if we just talk together. I took questions as much as possible.
Well, thanks so much, David. If you wouldn't mind, for your questions, if you would just identify yourself quickly and then give your question. If you don't mind, I'll start us off. From your articles, I gathered that you don't feel that Darwin's theory of evolution has anywhere near the certainty of, say, things in physics. My question is this: is that a reductionist view in the sense that? Are you saying that really when we get down and study the smallest parts, we're very certain, but when we actually look at whole organisms, we're not as certain? Could you just explain?
Sure.
You go use that.
Should I use that?
go ahead and use
Okay.
that, and we'll pass this around. Just raise your hand.
I think it's a terrific question, and I wish I had a terrific answer. What I would say is that what we really need to do is be honest with ourselves about where there is intellectual sophistication, grandeur, predictive power, and an extraordinarily rich understanding of fundamental concepts. I don't think that's in biology, at any level in biology. I do think there are parts of mathematics that certainly exhibit those properties. I think mathematics is our richest and most comprehensive, most complete, most interesting, and most intellectually sophisticated system of thought. I know of nothing comparable. Professor Rosenhaus, who's a mathematician, we were just mentioning this a second ago. I know nothing comparable to the body of knowledge subsumed under the title real and complex analysis. There's nothing like that anywhere in our experience. It's detailed, it's precise, it's full of rich ideas, and it has access to one of the most unusual concepts in all of human experience, the concept of a proof. We actually get a proof. I think parts of physics are like that. Not all of them, but parts of physics. Certainly Newtonian mechanics after 300 years and the complete reformation of Newtonian mechanics in the 20th century. That is a stupendous body of knowledge. Why that should be so, perhaps there's something of historical accident. This is just what the great minds of the 17th century began with. They didn't begin with biology. Perhaps there's something deeper at issue. I suspect there's something much deeper. In physics, there's a phrase called no-go theorems. And they are theorems, that is actually statements that can be demonstrated, that you can't have a certain kind of knowledge. I mean, that you don't go there. It always seems to me biology is protected by a rich body of no-go theorems, things that we cannot truly get our hands on. I mean, after all, look around the room. Here are 2-3 dozen examples of a biological structure. If we were to say, can you describe these biological structures in the same level of attention and detail you can describe a black hole? The answer is no. We wouldn't know how to begin. What makes a certain area of space and time, or space-time, a living system? No idea. No idea. Why living systems have the properties they do, to what extent are they accidental, adventitious, design? We don't know. We don't know. Yes?
Hi, my name's Ed. I go to Towson University, and I traveled from Towson today here. I wanted to, you talked about Newtonian mechanics, and I accessed some of Newton's theological writings online. There's a Newton project where you can read some of his theological writings. And I always found it interesting that I was raised with public school, brought up in public school, and they never mentioned the fact that Newton wrote far more on theology than he did on physics.
And it's not been read.
It hasn't been read.
This stuff is sitting there. You want to read 1,000,000 pages by Newton in Latin?
Amazing, isn't it?
And I tried it. I got a sentence into that stuff.
But one of the things that I think is interesting is the atheists are the ones, the Darwinists, so we call them, are the ones that demand that, for instance, theories like intelligent design should not be even spoken, should not be brought into science or into the classroom.
Yeah.
And one of the problems I think there is that Darwin's theory, there are people who critique it based on Cambrian explosion and these kinds of phenomena.
Body of critical literature.
And within Darwinists themselves.
Yeah.
And but the problem I see is that Darwin's theory doesn't necessarily refute intelligent design, because you still have the probabilistic issue that people like Michael Behe and so forth put forward, and that is that
Could you just repeat that? Darwin's theory
does not refute the probabilistic, the improbability of life arising, which
I mean, if Darwin's theory is true, there would still be probability.
there would still be probability issues, because we have structure in the universe, and we don't really know how to account for that, whether it's the structure of a room or the gravity or something like that. Why did it happen with structure as opposed to sand in a pan that's just all sprinkled with no structure to it?
It's very similar to the question we ask about moral life, too.
Mhm.
Why is there structure there? Why are the laws of physics true? And in a deep sense, why are they true? Do they reflect, as Einstein had hoped, some form of underlying cosmic necessity? It doesn't. I hesitate to make a claim I can't back up, but the idea, as Steven Weinberg very often expressed it in Dreams of a Final Theory, that we would discover a final theory that was logically necessary. I don't see any evidence that we're moving in that direction. We're moving in the other direction.
Certainly. Now, one of the things I can think of is with Cambrian explosion, it's very interesting because you have a whole lot of life forms appearing suddenly in the fossil record. And one of the things...
Less suddenly now.
Less suddenly now, but still, there is that. There still is what's known. But you have extinct civilizations. Try to follow my thought here. Like the Egyptians and so forth like that. And they have writing and language that evolved, and then these civilizations died off. It seems to me that you have intelligent design that occurs by nature and then disappears in the same sort of sense that you have Cambrian explosion. And for instance, when human beings design things, it seems to me that you have intelligent design and natural laws acting at the same time. So my point is, I don't see why Darwinists all the time try to refute intelligent design with Darwinism. That's my problem. They both coexist. It's just to what degree and where do they exist?
I mean, no matter how committed a man may be to Darwin's theory, he's always open to the possibility there may be some further category of explanation in which design plays a role. But I take it that's not the argument you want to make. The argument that anyone defending Darwin's theory would make is that there are no probabilities that are exorbitant within the theory, no probabilistic peaks that have to be scaled, no resources that have to be introduced, that the explanation as it stands for its proper domain is relatively complete. That is the claim. Whether it's true is another question entirely.
Hi, my name is Richard Hyde. I've enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank
there
you.
are two books I'd like to mention. I just want to see if you've read them and found them helpful, who I think, two authors thinking in similar lines. One is Hannah Arendt, of course, in The Human Condition, questioned technology an awful long time ago, or the dangers of technology being, or technologism, I guess, would be what she's critiquing in The Human Condition. And then more recently, a British journalist named Brian Appleyard has written a book called Understanding the Present, also a brilliant critique of science, brief, comprehensible.
Yeah, Hannah Arendt, her discussion is, I agree completely with you, just extraordinary. And it's really a regret of my life that I didn't know her, because everyone I knew her very well. My father knew her, all his friends knew her, and a uniform opinion that she was just a very, very capable and intelligent woman. I agree completely. I haven't read enough about the other guy, Appleyard. Yeah, I don't have anything particularly intelligent to say, but I think the whole issue of technology is a fascinating issue. I'd like to write a book about it, just entitled, Why Is There Technology? It does seem kind of like a gift. I mean, look around us. Compare our lives with the lives of the animals. I mean, the dog, or a cat. We've got artificial lighting, we've got a room, we've got air conditioning. What exactly is it about the structure of physical thought that has made all this possible? Should we be grateful? Is it possible to imagine a world completely without technology because the laws of physics are so rigid they permit nothing except what they themselves compel? It's an interesting idea. I don't know what to say about that. But it's certainly something that has not been properly discussed. Not only has it not been discussed as an intellectual issue, but the moral issues are very unclear. One of the things that strikes me again and again about technology is that it's completely exempt from democratic control. Control of the market, possibly, but I don't believe it. I mean, no market force has made the computer inevitable. No market force has made nuclear weapons inevitable. And I do think the scientific community reacts with outraged hysteria whenever this is pointed out. There's a very interesting case that just occurred. Two crackpots said, talking about the new Hadron Collider that's supposed to go online in about 6 weeks or 8 weeks. Neither of them are very capable physicists, but they ask a question that physicists had been talking about. Suppose the Hadron Collider spontaneously forms a little black hole. The physicists said, well, that's great. That's what we're looking for. We'd like to see a black hole. But Hawking tells us that it will radiate away immediately. So what these guys said, well, suppose it doesn't. Suppose it's stable. Well, what would it be like to have a stable black hole in Switzerland? Well, one thing I can tell you is there wouldn't be any Switzerland left. If it's really a black hole, and if it's stable, if it keeps on ingesting stuff, it will destroy the universe. How could you take that concern seriously? The physicists say, yes, there is a finite probability. It is 0.06,000 decimal places. It just isn't going to happen. Well, suppose it does. Very, very small probability weighed against an infinite cost. Is that the kind of moral calculus you're prepared to embrace? Well, all I can say is I'm glad I'm not there. I don't want to write an op-ed defending that one. Physicists scoff at black hole possibility. Yeah.
My name's Jason Rosenhaus, and maybe just a few general comments. I'm not sure if there's a question at the end of this beyond how do you react to what I'm about to say. I think, fine with me, I think you might be exaggerating the role that science plays in the books of Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris and Dennett, and maybe to a lesser extent Victor Stenger and people like that. And Tanner Edis. None of these people, as far as I know, claim that science proves atheism or that it's a logical consequence of any particular scientific theory, most notably evolution, that implies atheism. The role that science plays, most of them don't even, like Hitchens and Harris in particular, say very little about science in their book. They're more interested in the sort of the cultural effects of religion. And even Dawkins, the main role that science plays in his book is just to refute the argument from design. That Paley's argument used to seem really convincing to everyone. I believe, actually, in your commentary piece, you said it's convincing to everyone. So I think Dawkins' point was that seems like he would probably phrase it more colorfully, but that it seems like a less convincing argument. And furthermore, I would add that we often talk about theism versus atheism, but really, no one's talking about deism here. No one's, it's one thing to say, well, we haven't discovered any tangible evidence, of God, but maybe he exists nonetheless. But most people, I think, hold a certain conception of God. Like, for example, you talked about finding some authority for moral judgments. Well, you need a certain kind of God to justify that. And in particular, if you have sort of the Christian view of things, is that we're the intentional products of a God who loves us and a God of omnipotent and omnibenevolent God. And then you have science coming along and telling a story about how we're the chance endpoints of hundreds of millions of years long process of evolution by natural selection, which is a singularly bloody process, singularly hard to reconcile with the picture of a loving God. So I think the conflict between science and religion, as you say, it's not a logical conflict. It's not that some aspect of science logically proves atheism. It's that the Christian view of things tends to seem unlikely in the light of what science has discovered. I think that was also the point of Weinberg's comment. It's not that something about the Big Bang or quantum mechanics or anything. It's not that anything about that says, oh, well, clearly atheism is now true. It's that we can't find any trace of theism, in it. And people used to do that all the time. It used to be, natural theology and whatnot. It used to be that science was the handmaiden of religion. So anyway, as I said, I don't know if there's really a question at the end of that beyond, how do you respond to any of that?
Well, I think you're right. I think I agree with pretty much everything you said. The differences between us would be matters of emphasis, stress, and accent. One trivial correction, the subtitle of Victor Stenger's book is How Science Shows There Is No God, or How Science is Disproved.
It was God, the Failed Hypothesis.
Oh, God, the Failed. Wasn't that the title? I forgot. I got it in here somewhere. It was something about what science has done. It had two? Forgive me.
Even here, I don't think claims that it proves it, just that it's people used to invoke God to explain things, and now we have better explanations.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. People did used to invoke God to explain things. Now we have better explanations. But the suggestion that rests with me is that perhaps that's because we have not suitably enhanced our theological understanding. That was Kurt Gödel's remark. Gödel was very seriously interested in these questions. He was also insane, but I don't think the two are incompatible. And he was bitterly unhappy with the state of theology. He said, there's no reason this can't be put on the same kind of foundation as Newton's mechanics. So I'd say yes. And if we're simply considering two hypotheses, one is a quantum mechanical explanation of the decay of a subatomic particle, the other is God did it, you know where I'm going to go if I'm going to place my money. I'm going to go with the physicist. But that's not the end of the story. It's just not the end of the story. There are levels of complexity that we as sensitive and suffering human beings want to address. And that, I think, is just left out of the picture when you go to Dawkins, when you go to Dennett, they're just happy as clams with the way things are. I find that intellectually very difficult to take.
More questions?
Hi, David. Mark Ryland, good to see you.
Hi, Mark.
A couple of
I
thoughts.
got something wrong with my computer. Can you help me with that?
Sure, glad to help out.
I tried. And it worked all morning.
Maybe we're looking at, maybe the whole question about scientism, it kind of inverts everything. And partly I think it's, I'm going to make an assertion and see if you'll buy into this. Mathematics is very attractive as the paradigm of knowledge because of its beauty, its consistency, coherency, its ability to give a certainty.
And proof.
Yeah, an absolute proof. But what is it exactly that we know when we know mathematical things?
You're not going to expect that I'm going to try to answer that one.
Well, let me suggest...
He wants to answer it right here.
Let me suggest the possibility that at least that what we know when we know those things isn't much necessarily about the world of material existence. At least not without a lot of careful thought and translation. And that leads us then to mathematical physics, which is our best attempt to bring together the world that we know either directly or indirectly through sense experience.
Yeah.
And this other world that we know through this other.
But look, the second we try to make any sense of a claim about material existence, I think the matter is philosophically hopeless. We can make no sense of mathematical physics in terms of material objects. I mean, not even the beginning. It's riddled with hopelessly obscure entities, mysterious forces, things that we can in no way place our sensory apparatus around, and we have to use a vast, complicated inferential tangle to get near them. I mean, after all, the beginning of physics, I mean, modern physics, is Newton. I mean, building on Kepler and Galileo, of course. What Newton said was, I got this incredible hypothesis, the moon is held in its orbit by the same force that controls the fall of an apple. I have known nothing in all of human history comparable to the force of that insight. And what's more, I have a formula that will explain it completely and precisely. What's this force like? Well, it acts at a distance against the panoply of empty space.
Yeah.
And it acts instantaneously. And what can I say about this? It's just nuts. That's how physics begins. And it's only 200 years later that Einstein comes up with something that seems a little more sophisticated. But by that time, we have another concept that's just riddled with mystery, the concept of the field. I mean, all of physics is a study of fields right now, not only the electromagnetic field that Maxwell introduced in 1859, but all the quantum fields. You take a physicist alone in a bar, give him a drink or two, and then say, the truth. Can you make any sense? You're telling me that these fields out there, and the fields interact, and sometimes they have no energy, and sometimes they have enough energy to pop up a particle, and half the time we can't see anything, and half the time they're interacting like mad, and you guys are claiming this is better than Thomas Aquinas? I guarantee you by the third drink he'll say, you're right, Dave, you're right. It's not better, but that's where we're at.
Well, you're helping me out here, actually, because I think we should flip it the other way, and I'll quote Nancy Cartwright, who said...
I'm sorry, you quote?
Nancy Cartwright.
Wasn't she married to Stuart Hampshire? Yeah, I remember. She
was a philosopher of
philosopher
physics.
of science.
Yeah, philosopher of science at LSE. She said, I used to be fond of telling people that there were no exceptionless laws of nature until a friend of mine said, all men are mortal. And I had to stop saying that. In other words,
well, you're speaking for yourself now, right?
If we go to the world of everyday experience, we do actually have a lot of certainty about stuff, but it's not mathematical certainty. It's a very different kind of certainty. So I guess what I would like you to maybe comment on.
Oh, there are lots of things we say we're certain about. I'm absolutely certain I have a nose.
Right, and we're certainly in this room having this conversation.
I don't doubt it. I wouldn't.
That's not scientific knowledge. And
no,
yet
you're right.
It's better than scientific knowledge, isn't it? I mean, if this knowledge was false, could our scientific knowledge possibly be true? If it was false that we built instruments and learned mathematics and did all the things we need to do at the level of everyday experience in order to do science. So isn't the
I guess it could be false. I don't know. I feel like I'm back in the philosophy seminar room at Princeton, and I know these questions go someplace odious.
No, I'm asking a simpler question. Not that whether this is true or not, but is it possible that scientific knowledge is more likely to be true than this kind of knowledge? It seems to me that that's in principle impossible because scientific knowledge depends on this kind of knowledge.
Yeah, but everything depends on what you mean by depends. I'm just going back 40 years giving you the answer I would have given in the follow. What do you mean by depends? Is there a logical connection, and how do you defend the logical connection? There used to be a whole body of research about that, whether we could actually derive scientific theories from sense data, for example. Nelson Goodman was wonderfully ingenious about defending the idea. But to tell you the truth, I don't think those are living questions anymore. We know that there's a lot of scientific research that's wonderful, that's interesting, that's useful, that makes unbelievably accurate predictions, and we certainly know we live our lives in complete indifference to most of it. Richard Feynman said that quantum electrodynamics is so accurate that if you measure the distance from New York to Los Angeles, the difference between theory and experiment would be smaller than a single hair. Now, I don't know whether that's really true, but the accuracy is pretty amazing. Accuracy is pretty amazing. My sense of certainty that the sun will rise tomorrow, or that I have a body, that I'm not an immaterial spirit, or that certain relationships are transitory, that love doesn't last, all those things is much more firmly grounded. And I think that's a universal human experience because, after all, very few people study quantum electrodynamics. But whether there's really a logical connection, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that since I started studying philosophy 45 years ago, the number of things that are said to be logical has diminished day by day. And we're forced to rely on pragmatic intuitions, hunches, the nature of the culture, scientific attitudes. The attempt, after all, to derive science from something pre-scientific, like sensory experiences or individuals or whatever. Tremendous amount of ingenuity has been devoted to that, but nobody pays attention anymore. I mean, how many people have read Nelson Goodman, The Structure of Appearance? And yet, it's an extraordinary work by an intelligence of the highest order. But nobody cares. And that's a factor that needs to be addressed. A lot of things are true, but nobody cares about them.
One more quick comment is, have you read Hans Jonas, speaking of Hannah Arendt, another one of Heidegger's children?
Hans Jonas.
Highly recommend Jonas as a
Does he write in English or German?
Well, both, but a lot in English.
But he's German, isn't he?
Yeah, he's German.
Yeah.
He was a German who fled the Nazis and taught it at the New School and other places. In the United States
No, I
decades.
haven't read him. But
If you're interested in writing, especially on science and technology, he would be another tremendous resource. And also, I think he's the greatest proponent of a kind of neo-Aristotelian view of nature, kind of reasoning from first principles on that. So.
thanks for the reference.
David, I wondered where you come down on the wishful thinking argument. People like Dawkins and Hitchens say that people who believe in God engage in wishful thinking, and some people have put the shoe on the other foot there and say that they are engaging in wishful thinking, that God does not exist. As a non-believer yourself, I mean, where do you come down on that?
It's awfully hard to know, but my understanding of the religious tradition is that it is a tradition, that is, people who are throughout history taking religious views very seriously, that it is full of agony and uncertainty and a great sense of self-consciousness about self-delusion. I don't know quite who Dawkins is addressing when he talks about wishful thinking. Certainly no one who in the 21st century takes religious faith very seriously is inclined to confuse a wish for the real thing. I think there's a very easy transference. Dawkins, through a lens of almost sublime and perfect ignorance, has considered the Muslim or Islamic community and said, these guys are just nuts. You know, to give them an atomic bomb, they'll explode it over Oxford, and that would be terrible. But the generalization is false. I mean, the religious tradition is very rich. It's one of great soul-searching, uncertainty, skepticism, profound anxiety. I think wishful thinking plays very little role, especially if you consider the nature of God. I don't know how many wishes are going to be fulfilled if this guy really exists and is as furious as everyone says he is. I mean, Dawkins writes that the God of the Old Testament is the most fearsome, indignant, homicidal, genocidal, homophobic, misogynistic creature on the face of the earth. You know, wishful thinking to have this guy judge you after you're gone?
Yeah, but
I don't think it's quite that simple.
So maybe Dawkins is the one who's engaging wishful thinking. I mean, I think it was Jonathan Swift wrote somewhere that he reports a conversation with somebody who, an atheist says to somebody on the street, explains the argument that God doesn't exist, and the guy on the street says, "Why, sir, if it be as you say, we can drink and whore and defy the parson." And maybe that's what a lot of intellectuals are really thinking. We
I'd
can
like to
do what
think-
we like.
Oh, that's certainly true. That's certainly true. One of the usufructs, one of the benefits of a complete absence of any form of moral authority in the universe is just this happy feeling we can do as we like. It is a continual torment and temptation to anyone who denies access to the divine. A torment because doing as we like, as we all know, ends up making people miserable, and a temptation because it's very hard not to do as one likes. But that's part of the apparatus we bring to those particular kinds of experiences. It's part of them. But I think wishful thinking, I'm not sure. You know, there's a wonderful remark in Boswell's Life of Johnson. And Boswell says to Johnson, you know, David Hume said, there's as much reason to fear life after death as there is to fear life before death. They're both an expanse of nothingness. Speaking for himself, sir, Boswell said to Johnson, what do you say about Hume's avowal of being completely free of the fear of death? And Johnson, you got to imagine this guy, 6'1", big, huge, massive, authoritative, says, sir, he lies. Put a pistol to his breast and see how, with what equanimity he faces death. And I think that's true of a lot of these rhetorical asides. A lot of them. Yes?
Hi, my name's William Worley, and I wondered if you could say a few words about chance and design. You studied linguistic analysis, I guess. No? It was on your
Sorry.
resume.
Linguistic analysis?
Anyway, you don't need to know linguistic analysis to...
You mean
to
like
say,
generative grammar and stuff like that?
well, no, I'm talking about the modern English philosophers who reduce all philosophy to...
Oh, sorry, my mistake. I was thinking you meant Chomsky, generative grammar.
I was thinking about
ordinary language
Wittgenstein and
philosophy.
A.J.
Yeah.
Ayer and people
Yeah.
like that, and Bertrand Russell. Anyway, chance and design seems to be the two central concepts around which evolution and intelligent design revolve. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about, for example, natural selection. Is that just a process governed by chance, or is there some design there? And then, in which case, it raises the question about what you mean by intelligence when you're talking about intelligent design.
Yeah.
Are animals intelligent? Well, I think they are.
Sure. Who would doubt
There
it?
seems to be a continuity, and so if things develop, you know, who's to say, how do you draw the line between what's an intelligent development and what's a chance development?
I think that's a good question. You know, as with all of these questions that seem very simple, there's a tremendous amount of depth underneath it. I could not say with any certainty that natural selection is really stochastic in nature, although it seems to me obvious that since environments change very, very quickly, the best we can do is to model environmental change by some sort of random variable, which makes all of evolution fundamentally stochastic because the product of two random variables is a random variable. But I don't have a lot of intellectual resources to defend that. It just seems to me that environments, if Darwin's theory is correct, environments should change very, very rapidly because there's a lot of things to be explained by changes in the environment. It's the same problem that behavioral theories of psychology faced in the 30s and 40s and 50s.
But that kind of begs the question.
Yes, it does. You're absolutely right. It does beg the question.
Because you're saying, if you say the environment is what elicits these chance responses, because the environment changes, therefore the creature has to change by chance because the environment changed. Well, that begs a question, because the creature may be making an intelligent choice to respond to how the environment changes.
I agree. I agree. That's why I said we haven't really reached that stage that natural philosophers reached in the 17th century, where they say these are the fundamental concepts. We're going to concentrate on them. Every time we try to get somewhere richer in biology, we run into exactly these kinds of questions to the extent that I've understood them. And we say, well, on the one hand, the other hand, but if you take it to the next level, don't you have the same? Yes, you're absolutely right. For example, Chomsky is a figure I admire immensely because he's revolutionized linguistics. And he talks about his own contribution. Language grows as an innate maturational program in the organism, just the way an arm grows. You don't learn to speak a language. You have a program that enables you to speak one when the environment cues your language learning ability, your language learning program. It's automatic. Children don't learn a language. They just absorb it. They suck it up. And he said that's the biological term. Happened about 1959, 1960. He's right. There's something about that that is much more biological than everything that the behaviorists such as B.F. Skinner were writing. The question Chomsky doesn't ask is, if this is a biological term and we understand the biological term in terms of random variations in natural selection, have we just not pushed up the problem of language acquisition so that it becomes a problem of how a species acquires something instead of a problem of how an individual acquires something? And the answer is yes, we've pushed the problem up. For the time being, that's probably the best we can do. It's not insignificant. It doesn't mean that we haven't learned something. What we've learned is the problem is deeper than we thought it was. Because after all, a species, according to Darwin's theory, is simply a behavioral mechanism, just like an individual in Skinner's theory. It learns. Skinner said the environment is changing all the time, and there's reinforcement. In Darwin's theory, it's survival. Maybe that's the ultimate truth. I don't know. It doesn't sound like it, though. It would be very remarkable if that were the ultimate truth, and it would be so disjoint from everything we understand in terms of the fundamental principles of physics. I would find that one of the great mysteries of all time. Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Todd. I'm a biologist, and this conversation reminds me of an example. I'm a little shallow in some of the details, but there is a married couple, academics, Doctors Grant and Grant, if I've got that properly, and they have visited the Galapagos Islands for a number of years.
Yeah, they lived there.
Right, okay, well, you're familiar with them.
Yeah.
Well, you're way ahead of me then, perhaps. But my question would be, is how do we look at design from the point of view of a more complex matrix? Because if for centuries there's been El Nino and La Nina working on the Galapagos Islands, and if in fact Darwin only visited for a very short window of time, he made a conclusion based on that very brief encounter. And yet the finches, you know, I go back to the Cambrian explosion, all those body types, all those body plans came, well, you may say less rapidly, but whenever they came with a genomic complement of information that may be horizontally diverse as well as vertically diverse in the long scale of time. But in the horizontal sense, the finches morph back and forth like the pendulum swings with the environment. And while they may change in their phenotypic expression, and you say, oh, this is now a shorter beak.
Yeah.
This now we swing over, it's a longer beak. It's the same population expressing these different phenotypes. And ultimately, it's one very plastic species.
That's how it looks to us.
Right.
That's how it looks to us.
How do we address the evolutionists with the concept that really this is more a design issue and less an evolution issue, in the sense that as it's expressed, had it been something that keeps extrapolating, okay, maybe Darwin is correct, but it doesn't extrapolate. It keeps coming back and forth.
Yeah, but
it's survival, but it's also a design.
In terms of the amount of actual evidence we have, compared to the length and complexity of life, we have vanishingly small amounts of evidence. It's perfectly plausible to say that with respect to the Galapagos finches, what we see is periodic variations in the size of finches. But we don't know that's true. We just don't know that's true. We think that may be true. How long have the Grants been sitting in their horrible little igloo in the Galapagos?
Well, I would posit that they've
20
been there at
years?
least long enough to watch
How
the
many
change go
generations?
back and forth.
How many generations?
Yeah, no, that's true. But on the other hand,
The
at least-
mysterious, ineffable event could have taken place before they arrived, and it might take place after that. We just don't know. What we do know, and the only body of evidence that I think is very, very suggestive, is we have a long 10,000-year-old tradition of animal husbandry. And we know a lot about what it's possible to do with artificial selection. And the answer is we can do some amazing things with artificial selection, but there seem to be inherent limits beyond which we can't pass. We don't know how to pass them. Maybe. No, it's not really the same thing, because there are constraints in place on artificial selection that nature cannot quite meet. For example, constraints in place in terms of time, speeding up processes. But I think the uniform experience that we've had with artificial selection is, just as you've suggested, that for reasons that we cannot quite understand. Maybe 10,000 years is just a blink. Maybe it's just too short. Maybe if we kept breeding the cows, we would discover one that started secreting Coca-Cola instead of milk. I don't know. Chickens that lay square eggs, pigs mounted on wheels. But we don't have the kind of experience that would enable us to say with complete authority, couldn't happen. We just don't know. Don't want anyone to forget.
Okay, I'm just an engineer. I may not go as deeply as you have, but let me put a couple of thoughts together and get your response to them. The first thought is everything that has a beginning has a cause. And the second thought is with the advances in astronomy and physics and whatever have you, we now have concluded pretty solidly that the universe, including both the material in it and time itself and space, came into being. And from that way, from those two thoughts, you could conclude that, or you could infer that the universe had some sort of transcendent cause.
I've heard that. I certainly heard that argument before. You know, everything depends on the context in which you put it. If you're making it in an informal context where you want to persuade someone, you know, I'm not nuts, I've got some serious ideas here, that's fine. If you want to do it in a way that would be persuasive in a philosophy seminar room, another standard of judgment comes in. If you want to persuade a mathematician, still a third standard of judgment comes in. I think there have been responses in literature to all three of your claims. It's just not obvious to me that everything that exists began to exist. That was your first claim, right? Everything that begins to exist has a cause. I feel like my head's a little full of ginger ale when I try to think about that one. What I immediately think of is, what's the underlying space? Because space in a mathematical sense, is it an open or a closed set? If it's open, there's one conclusion that can be drawn. If it's closed, there's a boundary that might not be part of the set. So a lot depends. There's been a lot written about this, very sophisticated stuff, and I think the only conclusion you can draw is that it's inconclusive, which is very suggestive in itself. Adolf Grunbaum, well, some Germanic name, at the University of Pittsburgh has written a lot about that. So you have two equally plausible accounts. What you've given is the classical medieval kalam argument, essentially Arabic. And it's a very powerful statement. Look, there's the universe. It began to exist at one time. What caused it? Got to be transcendent. The trouble is the word transcendent. Exactly what does that mean in that context? Explain what it means in a way that doesn't sound as if you're trivializing a question of great importance. Transcendent meaning a cause that's not part of the effect. It's very hard to make that work because any cause can be described as part of the effect by describing it as the cause of the effect. Does that not count as being part of the effect? That's an argument Donald Davidson used to give. I think the best we can do is say, we have conflicting intuitions. We don't know what to say about these questions. Deeply conflicting intuitions. We'd like to say, the universe, it's out there, it exists. Why does it exist? It exists for a reason. The reason is God. We'd like to say that. Everyone would like to say that part of the time. And no one wants to say it all of the time. It's like that. Let's be honest. that's the way life presents itself to us.
Thank you for giving me two questions. I hope you'll enjoy this question. I'm just a little more somewhat curious about your intellectual lineage. You mentioned your father knew Hannah Arendt, and so there's obviously a family of thinking going on
all
here.
these people were exiles together.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
why they knew each other. Hannah Arendt arrived in, I think, 1940, if I'm not mistaken. My parents came in 1942. And there was just a huge German community around these people. I myself grew up almost entirely in a German-speaking environment because nobody spoke English. Manhattan, northern part of Manhattan. I mean, the entire neighborhood is now Dominican. It's just wonderful to see the change. Everyone is speaking Spanish, just as everyone spoke German when I was growing up. But Hannah Arendt wrote for a paper called The Aufbau, and she very quickly gave up German for English. She was remarkably fluent in English. And there were all sorts of people around it. Don't forget, she was married to someone who was teaching philosophy at Bard for many years, Heinrich Blüchner. And she had many contacts in the German-speaking community that left Hitler's Germany before the war.
Did she know Tillich as well?
I think she knew Tillich, but you know, the great love of her life, of all things, was Heidegger. A love that survived his Nazi party membership, which is an extraordinary story in itself.
Well, if we don't have any further questions from the audience, I have one more for you. I remember that in 2005, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, that you had championed this. I thought of it because we have a couple questions about natural selection. This King Solver study from a few years ago was
That's right.
a meta study of natural selection's effects in the wild. Can you remind us about that study? And secondly, have you seen any updates in the literature in terms of finding natural selection at work in the wild,
It's
rather,
really
or is the best
tough.
we have going computer simulation? What do you see in that regard?
I don't know who's working in the wild. You know, studying natural selection in the wild is very difficult. For one thing, you've got to be in the wild, which is horrible. For another thing, just imagine trying to form an empirical study of grizzly bear mating habits. It does not commend itself as a graduate thesis. There are two landmark studies. Well, there's one landmark study in 1986, a publication, a book by Endler called Natural Selection in the Wild. And it had many cases of natural selection under what appeared to be very reputable empirical conditions. And then King Solver's meta study, which was published in 2001, 2, I forgot exactly, looked at about 600 different kind of studies of natural selection in the wild, and concluded that as the population size increased past 1,000, the effects of natural selection seemed to converge very, very rapidly towards zero, especially when you're talking about stabilizing selection. And they just reported this, and they said, you know, the question is very interesting. We'll have to give natural selection a lot more attention than we've been giving it. And then the study just disappeared. There were a couple of comments, but that's typical. That is what happens with negative evidence in any scientific discipline. Any scientific discipline.
Well, let's thank our speaker real quick. Thanks, David.
My pleasure.
David Berlinski is the author of several books, including A Tour of Calculus and Newton's Gift. He's a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute and a former fellow at the Institute for Applied System Analysis. For more information, visit discovery.org.